You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm Aaron Whiteman, your host and co-director of the Cornell Maple Program. Joining me today from our research station in the Adirondacks is my co-host and fellow country boy, Adam Wild. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Aaron. It is true that by coincidence, we both grew up as country boys from small towns in Western New York. And sometimes that surprises people, because they hear New York and they think, New York City. But New York State is mostly a rural, forested state dotted with lots of small little communities. For example, the town of Great Valley, New York, where I grew up, has less than 2,000 people. How big is your hometown, Aaron?
Well, my hometown of Wheeling, New York has just over 1,000 residents, and it's mostly forests and farms. I grew up on 65 acres on a small dirt road across from a cow pasture. And, it's a great community, but there isn't a lot of economic activity. I looked it up, and the median household income is about $36,000 per year, which is far below the statewide average of about $75,000 and the national average of nearly $71,000 a year.
Wow, yeah, that's really the same story for my community. In a lot of small towns and maple producing regions and really across the US. But that's interesting to maple researchers like us because maple syrup is a real opportunity for economic growth.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Adam. The current technology and market conditions make maple a good opportunity for generating jobs and income. But the full picture for maple is more complicated than that. Maple sugaring is steeped in culture and tradition, too. And that social geography creates some unique opportunities for sugar makers. To better understand what this means, I talked to Dr. Joey Aloi from Future Generations University in West Virginia.
For the past few years, Joey has been working on a project to grow maple syrup markets in Appalachia, to better understand the regional economic impacts of maple sugaring in those areas.
Now, before we listen to the interview, I'd like to note for our listeners that Joey's project is funded by the ACER Access and Development Program, which is intended to spur growth in the maple industry. The program is administered through the Agricultural Marketing Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's the same program that funds this show.
Sounds great, Aaron. Let's go have a listen.
Joining me now is Dr. Joey Aloi. Joey is an assistant professor at Future Generations University, where he also serves as the Agroforestry Network Coordinator. He joins us today to discuss his USDA-funded South Atlantic Maple Market Study. Welcome to Sweet Talk, Joey.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's dive right into it here. Can we get started by having you give us an overview of the project? What is the issue you're trying to address, and what are the big components of the project?
Yeah, okay. So the two big issues we're trying to tackle and trying to tackle them simultaneously is increasing consumer awareness of real maple syrup, in the Appalachian region primarily, and in the southern U.S. more generally. And we're also trying to increase the market presence or the access that the consumers have to domestic maple syrup in the southern U.S. in general and in Appalachia in particular. We have a handful of different strategies that we're trying to do to address these two concerns. One is through a regional distribution program that we're working with our partners at Appalachian Sustainable Development to distribute Appalachian branded maple syrup in southern markets, grocery stores, right? Authentic Appalachia is a brand that we came up with the logo, with the bottle, and we've worked out some of the logistics concerns too, so that it can move to southern markets. And Appalachian Sustainable Development is taking care of, they're a grant partner, and they're taking care of the distribution, logistics, and that sort of stuff. They have the trucks, they have the sales team, and all that. We're just a university. And then we're also looking at more local direct-to-consumer outlets as well. We know that in the Northeast, direct-to-consumer consumption and access of maple syrup is much greater. There's much more market saturation than there is in Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and places like that. And while we want to be able to tackle everywhere from Texas to Maryland, through the larger scale distribution efforts, those things we know take a lot of time and take a lot of work. And small scale producers like the type we have in Appalachia can do a lot of the direct to consumer marketing themselves if we offer just a little bit of support. And so agritourism has really been the backbone for that sort of work. But we've also done work with farmers markets and that sort of thing too. So that's sort of a big picture of what we're doing, trying to promote maple syrup generally in Appalachia. And we do some research too on what consumers think of and understand about maple syrup, how they learn, and those sorts of things as well.
So this project is focused exclusively on Appalachia almost. And if I can back up a little bit, I read your report and mentioned in the report that maple syrup was historically produced in Appalachia. And I'm wondering if you could provide a little more historical context, because I think that might surprise people that maple syrup was traditionally produced that far south. Do you know how big that industry was in its heyday and why it declined or why consumer awareness dropped?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think to answer it in a robust way, I need to give a little context on sort of what agriculture was like in Appalachia historically, right? So, there were much larger and more productive farms in the South, in those parts of the South that don't have mountains. I mean, that's the homes of plantation agriculture and large scale stuff like that. The Midwest has also had larger farms and sizable market gardens in the Northeast as well. Appalachia traditionally has a culture of homesteading and subsistence farming, right? Very different, very much a forest-based culture, but there haven't been a lot of cash crops. Some regions had some tobacco production, but for the most part, this was really a home industry, not just maple syruping, but pretty much all types of agriculture that happened in Appalachia, right? Home industry, maybe not industry, right?
Homesteading, is that what you mean by home industry? Like they're producing primarily for their own consumption and maybe a limited market of neighbors?
Exactly, yeah. And that's sort of been the history. Beginning in the 1870s, the Appalachian region industrialized rapidly. So railroads made that possible, but the wealth of other natural resources, maple, for timber production, is what really brought industrialization to the region, right? So it used to be that every hollow, every little neighborhood, every rural area would have at least a couple folks producing maple syrup for the region because that was how people got their sugar, right?
Mhm.
Homesteaders didn't have cash, so they weren't buying cane sugar at the grocery store for the most part, right? There was honey as well, of course, and when you get into the more southern parts of the Appalachians, people would grow sorghum for molasses making, sorghum molasses, cane sorghum. But yeah, people sweetened with whatever they could grow locally and get locally. When industrialization started to happen, first, people lost a lot of access to land, right? Many traditional Appalachian lifeways that involved being in the forest shrunk because access to the forest commons shrunk. Also, Aloi, you may not think is a traditional Appalachian name. It's an Italian name. A lot of folks immigrated to the
Mhm.
region to work in the mines in specific and brought different relationships to the land, right? When you're working in the mines, all the old lore of company stores and all that. It's just a very different relationship to the landscape. You become much more of a traditional consumer in a sense. So that's really what changed the relations and relation to maple sugaring as a practice. But I think what's changed the perception of maple syrup in the Appalachian region has happened sort of more recently, right? So that sort of change in eating practices that I talked about in relation to, company towns, company stores, and industrialization, that happened nationally, right? I mean, grocery stores are just much, much more common than they were a century ago, right? Grocery market chains, especially. In general, I think we're a less agrarian society, so people are less aware of where food comes from, how it's produced, and more susceptible to sort of our thinking is more influenced by advertising and there are new products available as well, like corn-based table syrups. They're much less expensive than maple, right? So all of that has happened nationally. And then what's happened more recently, right, since the 80s, is that the Canadian maple industry has exploded, and Vermont has also been able to brand itself very effectively as a maple producing state, not just branding and sorts of sales, but also in terms of production too. And so now Appalachians tend not to think of maple syrup as part of their own heritage unless they're part of the few families that still make it. And we always run into old timers who can remember making syrup with their grandparents, right? When they were kids. Every time we're out in public, it's something that still lives in the Appalachian cultural imaginary, but it's less prominent than it once was. The folks from up north have done a really good job of leading the renaissance of maple syruping in the country, and especially the Canadians have sort of dominated not just in the industry but in the cultural imaginary, where now people don't remember that it was a practice that was widespread across any rural part of the country that got cold enough to have the freeze thaw cycle in the winter, and Appalachia certainly does.
Yeah, if I could just inject a little bit of more of this sociological information here, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I think it's important for maple producers to understand these types of nuances of context, right? So what I'm hearing kind of in the background of what you're saying is this rural development initiative, right? And I read in your paper, I highlighted this quote that part of the power of agroforestry, and especially of maple syrup for community-led economic development, lies in the function of maple syruping as a focal practice and in the eating of syrup as the center of communal celebration. And I'm just wondering if you can say why that's important. How is that an important part of this project to increase the awareness and consumption of maple syrup?
Yeah, eating maple syrup is fun, right? It's something that I think, when we talk about economic development and community-led economic development, especially in Appalachia, we're often butting heads with some of those large landowners. And sometimes tackling these large issues can just be upsetting or emotionally taxing in that sort of way. Helping folks engage with their forests and their communities and understanding the forest as an important part of their community through maple syrup and celebrating maple syrup, particularly through agritourism, is just so much more fun. People really want to be engaged in that sort of work, and really it attracts a different sort of crowd than you might get doing other types of economic development work, like building housing or the emergency food network or that sort of thing. I mean, I think this is a broad, widespread American phenomenon, but in Appalachia in particular, pancake breakfasts are a deep, deep part of the culture, both for communal celebration and for fundraising for churches or, scouting programs or what have you. And in a lot of ways, those haven't been thought of, pancake breakfasts, as a type of community development, and they certainly haven't been thought of as agritourism. But when you bring authentic maple syrup to the table for your pancakes, and when it's from a local producer especially, then it really is an agritourism experience. And I think both in West Virginia at Mountain State Maple Days and in Virginia at the Highland County Maple Festival and some of the other festivals too, like White Top Mountain Maple Syrup Festival, we see how these traditional pancake breakfasts that are a deep and old part of Appalachian culture can become an agritourism experience that educates people about their local ecosystems and about the economy of maple syrup too.
Yeah, I'm glad you elaborated on that because it touches on something that I think is important, and that's just economic development generally. Appalachia is in some ways a poster child for distressed rural economies, right? That's why there's still the Appalachian Regional Commission and things like that. But those same elements of rural distress are present in a lot of the communities in the Northeast and Midwest, the rural communities that are producing a lot of syrup. And traditional economic development tools that states and counties sometimes deploy just don't work well in rural areas. Creating the little manufacturing hubs and things like that often fail because the other elements needed for development of manufacturing and so forth aren't there. But when you lean into these cultural attributes, it seems to gain a little traction. Does that ring true to you?
Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of traditional economic development practices and toolkits have sort of run aground in Appalachia. They've hit the rocks because they're sort of trying to import things that work very well in more urban areas or suburban areas to regions that don't have the same type of culture, but also don't have the same types of material infrastructure, right? The same types of social demographics or those sorts of things. One of the core principles that Future Generations University always centers in our economic development work is that we really want to build on the successes that already exist in a community, If a community didn't have anything that was going for it, it would have disappeared, right? There are ghost towns all over the country. So if a community is still around, there's something that's working there, and we need to find out what that is and sort of ramp it up. And maple trees are present in most rural areas in the East, right? In the Northeast especially, but continuing all the way down to North Carolina, although whether you get a good freeze thaw cycle that far south is, yet to be seen. We have a little bit of anecdotal data about North Carolina, but not a lot of, we haven't done any research ourselves. But maple syruping, like I said, does have this strong cultural history in Appalachia. And it's not the only thing. I mean, Appalachians are in the forests a lot in general. Appalachian forest products like ramps and morels, ginseng, pawpaws, persimmons, these, I think, are seen nationally and often even internationally as highly valued products. For a lot of Appalachians, this is part of our heritage that we want to celebrate, and we've always done it through festivals, pancake breakfasts, ramp feeds, that sort of stuff. And the economic development potential of highlighting and promoting things that are already working, that are deeply woven into local economies, even if they're playing a minor role, it's just so much easier than trying to import, a different type of new factory that the locals don't know how to use and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really well stated. And it's important for maple producers just generally to be aware that there's this dimension to maple syrup production, that it can be a driver of economic development. And they can take that message to their state and local representatives or to their local chamber of commerce and maybe lean into that as a way to move more syrup and create more jobs.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I know it's like this in the mountainous parts of the Northeast as well. But in Appalachia, agriculture has been of necessity highly diversified because the landscape is itself so diverse, right? It's hilly. You can have in not long of a distance in terms of miles or drives, you can move 3,000 feet or so in elevation.
Right.
And so the practices you have are going to vary regionally in very small regions. And maple syruping is a particularly valuable practice for economic diversification on these smaller farms because, in general, you're not going to have an extra 10 or 15 acres of flatland on a typical Appalachian farm to devote to corn or beans or whatever. You're probably using your flatland already if you're just a traditional farmer to the extent that you can. But your woodlot, you're probably underutilizing. And so when you're not doing much in January, February, March, you can tap your trees and have another income stream that diversifies your farm. And it maybe isn't, maybe it's not making a dent in domestic production of syrup in terms of these large numbers, but boy, it sure makes a difference on your bottom line having an extra $500, $2,000 every winter before you have to go make your seed purchases.
Right? Might be enough to pay property taxes and other important things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We found that even a smaller maple operation in central Appalachia, if you're working at the farmer's market scale, if you don't have much, much more than that, something around 500 taps, you can get a return on your investment of about 3 years, depending on the weather and depending on your markets.
With all that context, let's circle back and talk about the particulars of your project. Because one of your project's goals is to increase consumer awareness of real maple syrup made locally in Appalachia. And the second is to increase market presence for Appalachian maple syrup. So let's dive into goal number one and talk about the Highland County Maple Festival, because this is one of the events you highlight in your report. Can you tell us what this event is, how you interact with it, and why it's so valuable for the mission of your project?
Yeah. So the Highland County Maple Syrup Festival, Maple Festival in Highland County, Virginia, which is a small county, about 2,200 people. I think it's the least populated east of the Mississippi. It's been going on for, I think, 56 years now. It's the oldest continually operating maple festival in the country, which I think is surprising. It certainly surprised me. I assumed that somewhere in the Northeast would have been having a festival longer. But I think that this is sort of a testament of how even though there's much less production down here, because Appalachians are in the forest generally so much more than other folks from the South, we really celebrate that forest heritage in a way that maybe is a little outsized compared to its, production footprint. But the Highland County Maple Syrup Festival it's a large agritourism event, brings about 2,600 visitors to the county every year, which is, more than 10 times as many people who live there. And it brings in around $2 million a year. It's only 2 weekends, right? So 4 days total. So that's a lot to do in 4 days. And it happens in a way that I think probably most of the podcast listeners will be familiar with this sort of thing. The sugar makers open up their sugar camps. Sometimes they offer tours back through the woods in the sugar bush. Sometimes they just open up their shack and they're, hopefully, if the weather's been right, boiling some sap down and making syrup from it. And what we see there is it's very educational in terms of it opens eyes up. It shows you things that you can't see if you're just in a grocery store or even if you're just at a farmer's market, where you can speak one-on-one with the producer. Being able to look and see sap being boiled and watch an evaporator working makes people understand, how it's a natural product, right? How it's a forest-made product, and helps people understand and distinguish it as a commodity, basically. I mean, in the broadest general sense, they understand that maple syrup is different. And then now maybe they understand that this isn't, the corn-based table syrup is not just a less expensive version, but is actually a different product, right? When they go grocery shopping next year. So it does that sort of raising of awareness in general. But it's also, it also raises awareness of maple syrup as particularly as a forest product, right? And it has these resonances with Appalachian culture in general. A wood-fired evaporator looks an awful lot like the wood-fired pot-belly stoves that so many folks have in Appalachian households to keep their houses warm, right? You're going out in the same forests. I mean, these are Appalachian forests that you would see regularly if you are a visitor from Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, those sorts of regions. And so you don't see maple syrup as necessarily something that's weird and Canadian, and maybe they have some culinary uses for it, but you remember it, or you recognize that it has a regional history as well. And we think that helps lift the entire domestic maple syrup industry, that people understand it as American. I mean, this is Virginia, where all the founding fathers are from, right? It's also Virginia, the southern state, right? Archetypically southern. So people understand it, maple syrup, more as a broadly American thing, which we think is pretty good for the maple syrup industry nationally. It makes for attention to thinking of syrup as a local product, which really just rides the coattails of the local food movement in lots of ways, and the natural food movement and all that.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that regional branding in a moment. But first, I'd like to ask, you said this is a long-standing event. What in particular did this project do? How was it involved with this event? How did you learn, gather data, or how did you interact with consumers? Can you talk more a little bit about the specifics of the project?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I want to say that this festival has been sort of inspirational for Appalachian syrup producers in general because it is so long-standing. So now there are 2 Mountain State Maple Days in West Virginia, which is it's a very similar festival. Sugar makers open up their sugar shacks, but it's statewide in West Virginia. So it's less condensed. The economic impact we're less sure of. We're doing some research on it now. But the West Virginia Maple Syrup Producers Association, of which Future Generations is a proud member, and we have been, I think, since the beginning, we helped the Producers Association be aware of what's going on in Highlands. So then they were able to build that festival into something that has a pretty large outreach in West Virginia, too. The West Virginia Department of Ag has been very supportive of that as well. And I think, they're thinking now that it's the largest agritourism event in the state because it involves so many people in so many places. So Highland's been super influential for us for all those reasons. And so with this project, we decided to do 2 things. First is using it as an opportunity for education and for community building around maple syrup. And second, partnering with the folks at Virginia Tech to dig in and do some research on the economic impact economic and educational impact of the festival, right? And so I will make this available to you, Aaron, and you can make it available to podcast listeners when the publications come out. But we've already internally created a report on the economic impact of this festival in Highland County, and it's something like $2 million that it makes for that little county, and brings in a lot of people and educates them. That information was new even to the Highland County Chamber of Commerce because it's tricky to measure this stuff. And I think it's something like 86 or so percent, I'll have to look it up, are going to continue to visit in the future, right? So it creates an interest in visiting the area in general. So we studied that and we learned that as well. And then about 20 or so percent learned for the very first time what real maple syrup is and what distinguishes it as a product. So we think that's super impactful. And we are happy that we did that research and measuring the impact of the festival. When you're there and you see all the people and you see everyone flock downtown to the vendors to get maple glazed donuts, it feels like it's making a big difference. But now we have some data, 2 years worth of data. And like I said, we'll be able to publish that in the near future. And we think that sort of shows what we've believed and seen as the impact of this. And then the second way that we've involved ourselves with this project, with the festival in Highland, is that we really do education and promotion. So there's 10 sugar shacks open, but not everyone who comes to the festival actually makes it up there, right? Some of these are hard places to reach. They don't have paved roads. They're not easy to find. And going downtown and celebrating with the folks in town is something that's much easier, especially if you have kids of a certain age who might not be ready to go up there in the woods. Or if, you yourself are of a certain age where you're not walking as fast as you used to. So we have a mobile sugar shack that we take with us that shows sort of this is what an evaporator is. This is where the sap comes in. This is how you tap the tree. And we can pull it with a pickup and we set it up and explain maple syruping as a practice, sort of for the general public, the folks who are just here to eat donuts or whatever. And then we also promote our own research there as well, so that people can learn a lot more about the science of sap flow and the science and economic relevance of maple syruping in Appalachia than they could, just by eating a donut, even though that's the fun part. That's what they came for, right? So that's how we involve ourselves through the promotion and the research of it.
Well, that's a lot of benefit you're getting out of this event. And it sounds like within that, there's a lot of opportunities to interact with consumers. And that brings me back to the regional branding issue that we were talking about earlier. And I'm wondering if you can share any data or anecdotes, especially about consumer reactions to Appalachian maple syrup and how that ranked against these other branding exercises like the Vermont made maple syrup. Were people surprised to learn that they could buy Appalachian maple syrup, or were they more excited about that than Vermont? Or was there anything you could tease out of those consumer reactions that is valuable to know?
Yeah. So there were one of the things that we did, again, partnering with Virginia Tech, is we did research with grocery store owners, right? Shelf serve rates. We went in and saw how many bottles and what type of bottles of maple syrup that were sold in grocery stores, and then interviewed the folks who managed those stores to see what they knew about it. And a lot of folks did not know that you could get Appalachian maple syrup. A lot of store owners did not know, and they said, we think we could sell a lot of that. People love to buy local here. So, I mean, that's been super important for us informing that, and we do think that the brand Authentic Appalachia, just through the simple, the logo, the label, really promotes that awareness, right? I mean, it's a picture of a small Appalachian cabin, smoke coming out of the chimney, a maple tree tapped on it, and it's literally a bottle of maple syrups. So as a consumer, you could see it and think, oh yeah, Appalachian maple syrup, hadn't thought of that before. And there's a little QR code on it where you could get to the website and learn more about the producers that make it. So we think that benefits regional producers broadly in terms of helping consumers understand that it's a product that you could find in the region, that you could, if you're really devoted to buying local, you can still get a locally made sweetener, right? And it can be maple syrup. And anecdotally, we hear all sorts of stories that, customers at a farmer's market, they'll say, "Oh, I'll never switch back to, the generic brand bulk maple syrup. I'm always going to get it locally. It just tastes so much better." And I don't know, we've never done any research on whether it really does taste any different, but
Right.
that sort of consumer loyalty says something. But I'll say too, once people consume real authentic maple syrup, they're interested in maple for culinary reasons as well, and that really boosts the industry as a whole, boosts the domestic industry in particular. I mean, there are some prominent Vermont brands that and a New York brand too that I've seen that have more of a foothold in Appalachia now than they did before the renaissance in Appalachian syrup making that we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. And of course that's going to be the case, right? Because even though it's a long and important part of Appalachian heritage to make sugar from maple trees, we don't make as much of it as the Northerners, and we won't. Our seasons, it's a little shorter, it's a little more iffy. And so once you're used to sweetening your coffee with maple syrup, you're not going to switch back to white sugar and spend another 20 minutes every morning trying to stir that up. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons we like maple, and so we think that the localness is what gets the foot in the door with Appalachian customers. But once they feel like it's something that is local, it's not a foreign or a Yankee product, then they'll be more likely to come back to it as a product in general.
As we're talking here, I'm actually looking at a picture of the label on my iPad next to me. And I think you've done a lot with the label with very few words. It says authentic Appalachia across the top. The picture, as you mentioned, is nice. And then the little slogan, tapped in tradition. I think that harkens to the fact that this is a traditional product. And this really highlights the importance of a good label. Some of these other studies we've looked at about marketing is that most people decide what they're going to buy when they're at the grocery store shelf looking at the product. And the thing that pops out to people is the label art. I know when I go buy wine, for example, I don't know anything about wine. I pick whatever has a nice picture on the bottle and is within my price point. And a lot of times, if there's a little bit of information or something that evokes an image that I enjoy, then I'll buy that product. And this label really evokes a lot of the right imagery, maybe for a target consumer of maple syrup.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. We spent a lot of time on that. We drew on art made from folks on the team, and we have a great graphic designer, Bruce Holderman, who really did a bang up job with that. And the folks who participate in that brand really appreciate it as well. That's why they like working with us. Also, I think we're pretty easy to work with. The brand doesn't hurt.
Right. Yeah. So branding was definitely a big component of this project, and looks like a nicely established brand so far. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds over time. Are there any plans to gather data beyond the lifespan of the 3-year grant? Are you going to track progress in any other way?
Yeah, I mean, we are certainly going to continue to promote maple syrup and try to understand its economic impact. The brand in particular, so much of the promotional power of the brand leans on whether it's on the store shelves or not, right? And that's why we partnered with Appalachian Sustainable Development, who is a great organization that's been doing this sort of work for years. And this is a process that moves slowly. So we don't know. Right now, it's on a few store shelves, and in southwestern Virginia mostly, North Carolina and Tennessee as well, I think a couple places. And once we get it more widely distributed, the plan is to get sort of research on how quickly it's selling, whether people have a sort of brand loyalty to it. And we're going to do follow-up interviews with store managers like we did at the beginning, seeing, what do your customers think about this? How do you think about it as a product? How does it increase your sales in general? But when we're going to do that is a question. We probably won't get to it before the end of this grant cycle, just because it's tough to interview store managers when it hasn't made it to their shelves yet. And we're getting there, and it's moving slowly. USDA grant cycles and the timelines that grocery stores work under aren't always the same. So I will let you know about research that we have finding out how well this works once we have it. And then you're welcome to ask me back to give you the details.
Yeah, that sounds great. We're really looking forward to hearing what you find, and we'll definitely connect our listeners to the results of that research once it's completed. In thinking about the future of this brings me to my final 2 questions for you. And I forewarned you about this. I wanted to ask you a tough question. So I'll ask the tough question first. So as of the 2017 Ag Census, Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland combined made just over 16,000 gallons of syrup. And as many of our listeners know, there are plenty of sugar houses in the Northeast that make more than that in one sugar house every year. So it's not a huge amount of syrup. And also there's the fact that climate change is really making sugaring more difficult with these warmer springs, which seems like it will impact the southern zones of sugaring disproportionately. So given this kind of the small market now and the difficulty of growing the industry in the face of climate change, why is it worth it to do this project? Is there a future for sugaring in Appalachia? Are the taxpayers getting their money's worth from this project?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's a hard question, and it's a really good question. I think we've actually, without meaning to, answered this question or a lot of it throughout our entire discussion of economic development and of community development, right? This is one of the reasons we got into syruping and promoting the syrup industry is not just because we like to eat it, but also because we found that it makes a big difference in these communities. I mean, that's just the economic impact of the Highland County Maple Festival is far beyond just the impact of syrup sold, right? There's layers and layers. The restaurants get involved, hotels, and all that sort of thing. And so if it weren't for being able to layer and pull these things together, I think it would be a very different picture. But with agritourism and community education and good forest management, these things appear much more shining and promising than they otherwise might. I should point out that NASS hasn't been gathering data from West Virginia since I think it was 2018 or 19. And I don't think from Virginia or Maryland either on maple syrup production. So we do have state level data that shows that production has been improving pretty significantly, but that it's much, much more weather dependent than I think it is up north. So we expect that not just to continue, but to get worse. So that's a real concern, and it's something that we're worried about. But again, I want to point to the uniqueness of Appalachian farms and the uniqueness of maple syrup in the economic picture of the Appalachian farm. Like I said, these are smaller farms, they're highly diversified, and maple syrup is just one of many things that people are doing to help pay the bills. And then one other thing I do want to say is that maple syruping syrup making is a traditional practice. It's something that people have done for a long time, but boy, the technology has improved a lot right now. We have two ongoing research projects at Future Generations, both of which Mike Recklin could tell you way more than I could about, that investigate. One looks at best practice demonstration areas. And so this last year, 2023, was just a horrible season, I think, for most sugar makers in West Virginia and Virginia and Maryland too.
Because it was too warm during the sugaring season?
Exactly, because it was a warm February. And then we got a cold snap in early March, but a lot of taps had run dry by that point. People had pulled the taps, that sort of thing, because they just thought it was not going to go well. But we did have one model demonstration area, best practice demonstration area in Wise County, Virginia, which is the far southwest corner of Virginia, closer to Kentucky than to Maryland, right on the Kentucky border. And at that farm, everything's on 3/16 tubing, which is great for natural vacuum, which works great in Appalachian farms because of the drastic height differences between where the trees are and then where you're going to collect the sap, right? The collection point.
Mm-hmm. And probably a lot of these remote sugar houses are far away from electricity too. Is that correct? So natural vacuum is the only option for vacuum?
Oftentimes, yeah, but this gentleman does have a little artificial vacuum as well. Nothing too serious, I don't think. I think it's like a little SureFlow or something. But yeah, and he was able to produce, as much as he usually does because he was using the correct tubing, he was using precision tapping, and he was using a little bit of artificial vacuum as well. And our largest producer in the state, West Virginia, also had not a banner year, but a remarkable production year this year because of improvements in these production practices. Now that, I think, if you're thinking about whether it's worth it to the taxpayer, everything that we're going through in Appalachia right now, where we're trying to figure out what the best practices are to yield more sap, that's going to be happening in New York and in Vermont in the next 50, 80, 100 years, you know? It may get too warm here in West Virginia and in Virginia to do maple sugaring altogether. We don't know. It's hard to tell how much we can expect from these technical innovations, but we know that, 100 years, 120 years from now, Vermont's going to be in the same situation that West Virginia's in right now. And those are under the best scenarios, best case scenarios for maple production. So, learn it now instead of having to learn it under the gun 100 years from now, right?
Right.
So when I think of whether taxpayer money is being well spent, that's huge.
So I think I heard 3 different answers in there. So let me paraphrase and say those back to you and see if I got it right. So first, on the question of impact, there's a temptation, I think, in the maple industry to measure everything in terms of number of taps and gallons produced. But what I think I'm hearing from you is that a gallon of syrup produced and sold in Appalachia maybe has a larger impact overall economically because of the significance locally to the economy than it might, say, in Vermont or something like that. Is that a correct paraphrasing of the way you're gauging the impact?
Yeah, I think that's that's a good paraphrasing. I mean, we had, for example, in Pendleton County, West Virginia, we had a maple-themed farm-to-table dinner, 4 courses, 5 courses. Maple syrup was an element of each of the courses, but most of it was not maple syrup, right? So in terms of the amount of syrup that you need for an event like that, it's very little. But in terms of the economic impact of a dinner for 60 people, that's much larger, right? And so because of the way that we integrate maple syrup into agritourism generally, we find that it has an outsized proportion. It's sort of like a flagship, right? A flagship product for local food generally, because it's something that it is shelf stable. It's a great product that a little bit can change the flavor of a dish, and it just makes a difference.
Yeah, that's a fair point because, outcomes can be measured a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, like the very end outcome we want from any of these projects that we invest in as a society is an improvement in our quality of life. And that's sometimes a little harder to measure. But what you're saying here is you're kind of explaining a broader impact, which I think is important. And the other 2 things that I'm hearing in your answer around what's the potential for this industry is that with the new technology, you feel that there's a chance for the industry to grow despite the climate. And that's something we focus on a lot at the Cornell Maple program. So I understand that part. And then lastly, which I think is a really salient point, is you're saying, okay, the Northeast is going to be facing these same climate issues a little bit further down the road, and that West Virginia makes a nice laboratory for understanding how that will unfold. And that has value as well. So am I paraphrasing the last 2 points well, or is there anything I'm missing in your answer?
No, I think that's great. I mean, I'd say the metaphor of a laboratory is probably appropriate given how much research we're doing, but another metaphor, we are the canary in the coal mine, right? And I think, the technology is important, and I don't think there's a lot more to say about that. It will extend the existence of the maple industry in Appalachia beyond what would otherwise be considered natural, right? But I don't think we're gonna. If you can't manufacture a freeze thaw cycle, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't
Yeah.
solve the problem. It just alleviates it a little bit.
Right. For the bigger climate questions, we're going to need a bigger rescue than what we can kind of tinker and cobble together and make work on our own, for sure. Let me close out by asking this one last broad question. What does success look like for this project and for the longer term vision you and future generations has for maple sugaring in the Southern Appalachians?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I sort of mentioned earlier when we were talking about communal celebration, we really focus on finding successes and building from them in the way that we do community development work at Future Generations University. And so in a lot of cases, we end up in a situation where we have started from a success and we have continued to have that success. And maybe it's grown a little bit quantitatively, but it's difficult to know when we're done, right? And I think that sort of continually iterative process of community development is something that, looking at it from a project perspective or from a, grants perspective, grant deliverable perspective, it's really tricky because you don't want to say it's going to get even better after you quit funding us, right? Um, and it's difficult to, capture that. But boy, in our everyday lives, that's something that we absolutely want, isn't it? For life to continue to be getting better and better and better and better for our kids than it was for us and better for their kids and all that, right? So it's difficult for me to say what an endpoint would be, but to know that we have succeeded. The 20% of festival attendees in Highland who didn't know about how authentic maple syrup is produced, they didn't, differentiate it from non-maple table syrup. Them learning about maple syrup, that's a success already, right? So that's certainly part of it, that people learn the difference between a forest-based sweetener and, for lack of a better word, factory-based sweetener, right? So that's successful. And then another vision of success is that all the maple syrup producers, we do a lot of other trainings at Future Generations unrelated to this project with producers and those projects that I mentioned that Mike Recklin's leading on 3/16 tubing and on best practice demonstration sites are part of that. We do train new producers who've never produced maple syrup before. So success for us on this project, the marketing, promotion, and education work, is that these producers, every time we get a new producer or a new set of producers, a new class of producers, that they have an easier time promoting and selling and marketing their product, that it's a more sustainable industry for those who are engaging in it. So those are the big things that we're thinking of, right? First, people understand maple syrup in general and how it's distinct. And then second, that people who are producing syrup have an easier time with sales and marketing than they did before. That's really what we're hoping, and I feel pretty good about that.
You used the phrase, you said that market development is a continually iterative process. And I like that way of looking at it. And it sounds like you've accomplished a lot with this iteration. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about the project as you close it out and seeing what you have in store in the future.
Well, thanks so much, Aaron. I am too. Thanks for having us on here. And if anybody wants to reach out, my email is joey.aloi, that's ALOI, at future.edu.
All right. Thanks so much, Joey, for coming on the show. And we'll have you on again in the future.
Cool. That sounds great. Thank you.
Well, Aaron, you and Dr. Aloi covered a lot of ground there. What do you think are some of the main lessons from this research?
Well, as we noted earlier in the show, Joey's research is funded by the ACER Access and Development Program. And the point of that program is to grow the maple products industry by increasing both supply and demand. But hopefully, one of the real tangible end results of that is improved rural community well-being.
Yeah, I think we've all seen the growing importance of maple sugaring as an agribusiness sector with all these new and growing, sugaring operations creating jobs and income. But this interview was talking about, something more. Maple really is different from a lot of other crop commodities.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of us as sugar makers understand that maple is part of something bigger, but sometimes we can't quite find the words to explain why. And I think Joey does a good job of explaining how maple sugaring is woven into the social, economic, and cultural geography of small towns like the places where you and I are from.
Sugar making is definitely a cultural and a social activity too. It brings people together. It connects them with the cycles of the natural world. In that way, maple sugaring is a community project and a great rallying point for small town economies and sustainable forest management.
Yeah, that's right, Adam. And if maple producers understand the full potency of maple sugaring in terms of broader community impact and can articulate that idea, then it becomes a powerful tool for market expansion to increase consumer awareness and expand local government support for agritourism opportunities and things like that. Can you think of other examples, Adam?
Yeah, I think it's really important for maple producers to kind of be these brand ambassadors for maple, within their own communities or regions or even states or provinces that, getting involved with whether it's festivals or maple weekends, or farmers markets or maybe some festival that traditionally happens in your community to try to piggyback on that and include maple into that. One obvious positive aspect of that is that, it helps with sales of maple products, but I think also it creates that sense of place. And I think it's more and more important, as a culture that we sometimes get pulled away with technology and internet and social media that sometimes becomes kind of a negative world. But I think it's important that we as a community and maple producers to create that strong community where you live and work and play. And using maple for that could be really important.
That's right. Maple syrup. It's the sugar that binds us together.
Exactly. And it's really important to kind of also, making sure we're educating the next generation to be maple producers and consumers as well, because that's our future customers.
Yeah, those are all good points, Adam. So there are definitely lots of interesting insights from this research, and we'll be sure to keep you posted on any updates from Joey in the future. Before we sign off, we want to let our audience know that our podcast crew will be taking a short break in September, and we'll return with a new episode for you on the first Monday in October. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we'll see you in the fall on Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Join us next time for more Maple Sweet Talk. Have a sweet day.